by the end, by the time we are done, you can see why it's named the wheat has been. We didn't name it, but probably it was named by Jitu uncle or people who were involved in compiling this great collection of satsangs. So I'll start off without further ado. I first heard about Guruji in 2001 from Colonel D.S. Chatterjee, who showed me Guruji's photograph and told me about some of his miracles. I wasn't going through a rough patch in my life with a new job in a new city. I was supposed to be deputed to the UK within a month of my joining. But even after 9 months, the overseas assignment was nowhere in the distant horizon. On the contrary, I had to shell out a lot in settling down from scratch in an expensive city like Delhi in a rather unforeseen way. I was under immense financial pressure, and to add to our woes, my wife had a miscarriage. This left her with some symptoms, and the gynecologist suggested surgical intervention if the condition did not settle down on its own. We went to Guruji's Sangat at Empire Estate in July 2001, but were greatly disappointed when we were told that he had left for Jalandhar. It was on our next visit that month that we got our first darshan of Guruji. He spoke to us briefly and even ordered us to stay back for Langar. Those days, people were selectively told to stay back for Langar. As we came back home, we felt an unprecedented bliss and calm and slept peacefully after a long time. Since that day, everything in our lives started to fall in place. To begin with, my wife's condition improved promptly on its own. Within a few months, I got my first overseas assignment, which was a spectacular success, followed shortly afterwards by a long-term overseas deputation, which is still continuing. A few years down the line, we received his greatest blessings in the form of a baby boy. So it's over to my wife now to read the next chapter.
Jai Guruji. The blood pressure. So this is regarding me. So whatever is written. So my wife had a history of high blood pressure and she was put on medication as hypertension could potentially lead to complications during pregnancy or childbirth, apart from other malefic effects. Although the idea of lifelong dependence on medication was not encouraging. She went off medicines for short spells, but every time she had to fall back on them as her blood pressure started shooting up again. One day in early 2003 at the Sangat at Empire Estate, as my wife and I reached the end of the queue to receive prasad from Guruji, he looked at us, at the both of us, and said something jokingly about us wearing matching colors, as we were both wearing green. Then he asked how I managed to get the school from Chandigarh to marry me. This took us by surprise and obviously made us happy beyond words. This was reflected in my wife's blood pressure when she measured it the next day. For the first time in her entire life, her diastolic blood pressure recorded a perfect 80 without medication. Since then, she never had any problems until it flared up during the late stages of her pregnancy. But that did not cause any problems to the fetal growth, and she did not need delivering the baby earlier than the full term. She had to be on medication during late pregnancy and following childbirth, but was able to come off it shortly after.
So just before we move on to the next bit, so her blood pressure, as mentioned, never flared up before pregnancy, and after that also she came off it until a few years back. It came back again, but thankfully with normal medication, it has stayed in control. So he has to take medication daily, and in fact, when I have to do that, but it's probably just something that comes with age. But the question is whether it's controlled properly, and the answer is yes. So Guru has kept it. It's like her blood pressure, my diabetes. See, so these things haven't gone away. It's kind of lifelong conditions. But the thing is, the key thing, I guess, is they're under control with medication, and day to day they don't really cause any issues.
अगर कभी अगर मैं दवाई नहीं भी लेती हूँ फिर भी वो under control रहता है. So that's what I think is Guruji's blessings. Sometimes I forget to take my BP medication, but still it's under control, and I don't feel I can go like without 4-5 days without medication. But I feel okay, and my blood pressure, it's when I measure it, it's normal. It's obviously by with Guruji's blessings.
Okay, so so the next bit is about the overseas assignments. At that time, for any professional working in the software industry, it was quite key. Everyone wanted to go to the US, and I was an exception. Um, and the fact that I joined Siemens at Gurgaon back then was the reason was there was with the offer there was a promise of an overseas deputation to the UK. But after I joined, it was very elusive, so that overseas assignment was not coming through. And actually, that is the time when was waiting in Delhi for the deputation. That is the time when I met Colonel Chatterjee, and then he took me to Guruji's Sangat at Empire Estate, and that's how everything unfolded. So yeah, I'm greatly thankful for that, obviously. But at the same time, we were still waiting for um, the overseas assignment. We were waiting at Guruji's feet, but we were still looking out for the assignment, which eventually came. And this is the story. The next bit is the story of how that whole thing unfolded. So yeah, overseas assignment. A major factor behind my joining Siemens in Delhi in September 2000 was the associated prospect of long-term overseas placement in the UK. But the latter remained elusive. Though with Guruji's blessings, I had a couple of short visits to the UK. By 2002, the hopes of a long-term deputation abroad were virtually dashed with the international depression in IT that followed the 9/11 attacks in the US. However, I kept praying to Guruji both at Sangat and at home, and in April 2003, a UK deputation finally came my way. Though the assignment was supposed to be only for 6 months, I was very thankful as it came at the unlikeliest of times when companies all around were laying off people by the score. As I was waiting for my work permit and making preparations to leave, I received an invitation card to a marriage reception of one of Guruji's devotees. The envelope that contained the card had the word England written on it by Guruji himself. When we went to seek Guruji's permission just before we left, my wife was going to ask Guruji's blessings about her father and her sister, a Down syndrome patient, um, while we were away. But even before she articulated her concern about her parent, Guruji said, "Sadde to vadda parent kaun hai?" Meaning, who's a bigger parent than me? And we realized that we had secured the maximum reassurance that we possibly could in this matter. On my arrival at the site in Blackpool near Manchester, I was told that there was a distinct possibility of the assignment even ending in 4 months instead of 6. However, by Guruji's blessings, not only did the deputation last out its full duration, my contract was further extended for another project at the same site. This project lasted for 10 more months, and when I was all set to return to India in August 2004, I was relocated to a different location called Telford near Birmingham within the UK itself for another assignment, which lasted for 1 more year. Midway through this assignment, we were relocated to Nottingham, where my child was born, just as the project completed. As we were making preparations to travel back to India in September 2005, I was transferred to London on an assignment at the prestigious BBC site in London. The initial deputation was for 3 months, but I have been here for nearly 2 years, and it is still continuing. So obviously, this dates back to 2007. And at that point, my deputation at the BBC was still on. It's since been nearly 12, 13 years. I'm no longer at the BBC, obviously, but I'm still in the UK. And just because Guruji had written England on that invitation card, and people used to say jokingly that that's my work permit, visa, work permit, permanent residency, citizenship, and so on. So that one word written by Guruji was everything. and actually it's exactly turned out that way. There have been times when we have planned to go back to India. There have been times when we had to literally pack our bags to go back to India. And there was a time when we wanted to come back to India, as I wanted to send my son to school in India. So back then I had certain misconceptions about education in this country, and I thought that it would be better to educate him in India. But Guruji knew better, obviously, and we couldn't go back even when we wanted to. All these years, after all these years, we realized that Guruji led us in the correct path. Though at times we felt that we should have probably gone in another direction. But in hindsight, we now see that everything that he has decided for us has worked exactly the way he planned, and it has been good for us. Okay, so it's over to my wife for the next bit.
Transfer to Nottingham. I was on deputation at a small town called Telford in Shropshire, England, when my wife conceived. It was a nice and quiet place to live in, but seemed quite nightmarish in terms of medical facilities regarding to pregnancy care. The obstetric unit in the local hospital was run by midwives and did not have the consultant unit. More complicated cases were referred to a bigger hospital at Shrewsbury, which was located around 16 miles away, and it took more than half an hour each way by taxi, apart from the journey being very excruciatingly expensive. My wife's history of hypertension meant almost certainly that she would be referred to the Shrewsbury Hospital eventually. We panicked even at the idea of having to travel that kind of distance in the event of any emergency during her pregnancy or when she went into labor, even though the ambulance service provided by the National Health Services or the NHS is usually very commendable. Also, the hospital rules did not permit husbands staying overnight when wives were admitted for delivery, and I desperately wanted to be within a reasonable distance of the hospital, even at night, when my wife was admitted. But I could not see that happening if I had to go back all the way home. We left everything to Guruji as usual. One night, my wife had a dream that she was sitting at Guruji's feet, and Guruji told her to stop worrying, as everything will be all right. Within a few days, there was a communication that the unit in Telford was closing down, and the staff was being relocated to Nottingham, a bigger city with much better facilities. Eventually, my child was born in Nottingham, the Queen's Medical Hospital, which is rated as one of the best in the UK in terms of pregnancy care. Now, there are a few things, like when I was pregnant, and because I had the history of miscarriage before, and so I was always worried. And this journey, as most of us we know, that the first trimester of pregnancy is very crucial. So I was always worried because I think it was in January when I went for my first scan, and I was a couple of months pregnant. And it was I think in March or something, when my husband said that we have to move to Nottingham now. And I was very worried because I didn't want to move in my first trimester. And there was nobody around us, any friends, no one to help us. So I was literally very worried that we were settled in one place, and like we just got this house on rent, and now we have to move. But eventually, looking back now, I mean, after all these years, this hospital in Shrewsbury, it has turned out that that hospital wasn't the best hospital possibly to have a child, because there were many complaints, like of, I think, child death,
There were
like
court deaths and unexplained court deaths.
unexplained, like baby deaths.
So there were court cases going on.
There were a lot of cases as well. So now we understand why Guruji wanted me to move from Telford to Nottingham. When I was like, at that point, I was like, Guruji, like, I'm just so confused and I'm just so worried. Just help me out and just help us out, like in this crucial time. But eventually we moved. And I remember when I think it was a 3.5 hour journey, because we moved with all our things and I think we sat in the front of the truck, and every point when there were any bumps, and it was quite a long journey, and I was always worried what's going to happen. But eventually, by Guruji's grace, everything was okay, and then we moved to Nottingham, and obviously it was like a bigger city, and the hospital was very close to our house, and eventually everything fell into place, and I sort of I it was okay for me. I got the best medical attention. and everything fell into place and everything was okay by Guruji's grace.
Okay, so that brings us nicely to the next part. So it's Nottingham House. Because we're moving midway through the project, it was always a challenge finding the right accommodation because every city is different, and it can be fairly challenging to find the right accommodation in the first shot. People usually have to, people are seldom happy with, when one is on an overseas assignment in a place which can be complicated. People don't usually tend to get the right accommodation the first time around. And specifically, this was very important because this is where my child was going to be born, which is why the significance, the extra significance of this accommodation that we were trying to find. And the next bit shows how Guruji guided us through this. So while a relocation was welcome from the point of view of medical facilities, our project team was then snowed under with workload, and we were not allowed the luxury of visiting Nottingham, which is 3 hours by train, in advance to look up houses to rent. Instead, our client was entrusted with the task of looking up accommodation for us. No exceptions were made, even in my case, despite my emphasizing to my manager the significance of the choice of this accommodation for us, as my wife would have to spend the rest of her pregnancy in there with no one else to look after her. A few prospective houses were looked up by the client, and the associated documents and internet links were sent across to me in the next few days. But they did not seem to work for us, and I turned them all down. Even before all this had started, I had casually gone on the internet, and on the very first search that I fired, I had a hit on a house that looked good and was reasonably close to the renowned Queen's Medical Hospital, where my wife was likely to be referred to for pregnancy care. However, I had absolutely no idea what the area was like, and even though the photographs posted on the site looked nice, it would have been too much of a gamble to go by them alone. But now, not liking the houses that were being looked up by the client anyway, we decided to go for the house that I had looked up myself at the beginning without even asking the client to assess or evaluate the same on my behalf. This was somewhat to the discomfort of my own project manager, as I was in a way overruling the judgment of his superior. But we put our trust in Guruji and went with our own intuition. That house turned out to be the best one that we have stayed in while in the UK. The house, as well as the furnishing, was in excellent condition, and it was 10 minutes walking distance or a 3-minute drive from the Queen's Medical Hospital. In a team of around 10 people that were relocated, everyone else ended up having serious issues with their accommodation that had been looked up for them. So even though we were not allowed to go around looking, we didn't visit the house from before, we just directly moved in. But everything fell in place, and the house was brilliant. The location was very good, and the question of getting that the first hit, or the first search that I did at the time, and back then, I'm talking about 2005. So portals like Zoopla or Rightmove were not there, or even if they were there, they were very basic. So looking up a house using the internet was not the norm back then. And actually, there was a rule that you couldn't really get rent, as in get a rental contract on a house, which you haven't visited yourself or which one of your representative hasn't visited on your behalf. I just blindly asked the client manager to do that on my behalf, and asked him not to use his own judgment, but just to trust me on that, which he did, and it all paid off. So yes, so for the next bit, it's over to my wife again.
Yeah. Fetal heart rate. It was one of the regular visits to the pregnancy assessment center in the Queen's Medical Hospital, and my wife was put on the fetal heart rate monitor. Usually it varied between 140 to 170, but on that particular day it was bordering 200 from the start. And then suddenly there was some fetal movement and the thumping just went crazy. The reading shot up to nearly 220. and stayed at that level. Up until then, the midwife was putting in a casual front saying that 200 was very high, but not an abnormal fetal heart rate. But then, after this, she quickly rushed off to seek advice from a superior. Fearing that the fetus was experiencing some stress, I placed Guruji's photograph, which was given to us by Guruji, on my wife's bump and chanted the Mrityunjay mantra silently. Within a few seconds, the heart rate went down to normal and stabilized. And by the time the midwife rushed back with her senior colleagues, things were normal. So in the UK, sometimes we always don't get to see the doctor, obviously, because the midwives, they look after us. And so I remember, because I think in my fifth or sixth month, in my second trimester, I think, I gradually sort of like developed a bit of high blood pressure, and I was put on some medication so that it won't harm the fetus. And then, because I had this high blood pressure, sometimes they used to monitor me regularly. They used to take blood pressure readings and monitor my child's heart rate. And so sometimes I used to go there like quite often, like at least once a week. And this particular thing, when it happened in this particular incident, I remember, because we always had Guruji's, like the photograph he gave us, we always carried that. And I remember this particular instance because you can feel when your baby is like, the heart rate is so high, sometimes you feel, maybe the baby is moving around a lot, or, like something happened, because these things used to keep happening sometimes, because you can feel when the baby is kicking, when the baby starts kicking. And sometimes the whole day, he used to kick a lot, like 40, 50 times. And sometimes it used to happen that there was no movement at all. And because my husband was very busy, he used to come home at like 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night. And I used to be so worried that what's happening, like there's no movement and what's happened. So then we used to just take a cab and go to the hospital, and they used to put me on the monitor. And sometimes I used to keep praying to Guruji throughout, like what's happening and help me, and then sometimes they used to see the baby is, for some reason, he has gone to the back side. So that's why they couldn't monitor his heart rate. So, and then after like maybe the 2-3 hours of monitoring, they used to say, "Oh, your baby is fine. It's just that he has moved back towards the back of your body," and then everything would be fine. I would just come back. So these things, this is just one of the instances where we always have a faith in Guruji. That's the absolute faith. I mean, we had nobody. We didn't have any relatives. We didn't have any friends, because I mean, most of the, I think the project was nearly ending. So most people, they just, I think, went back to India. So we were literally there in Nottingham with nobody around us. We knew nobody. I mean, the neighbors were there, but they used to go to bed at like 7 o'clock, 8 in the evening. So I was always very scared. And like, so I always have had my faith, which absolutely helped me throughout my pregnancy.
I think you can read the next bit. So the next bit, I think it's more appropriate for my wife to read, because it's mostly her experience rather than myself. So, so she'll keep reading the next bit, and then I'll pick up the next part.
Yeah, so start. Childbirth and following complications. In 2005, by Guruji's grace, we were blessed with a baby boy. He was born in the Queen's Medical Hospital in Nottingham, UK, where I was then deputed. My wife had a very long and painful labor. At one stage, her diastolic blood pressure had even shot up to 132, despite repeated medication, and she was delirious, leading the doctors to consider the option of performing emergency C-section operation. However, on praying to Guruji, her condition settled down and the baby was delivered normally. So I would like to stop here, because there's a lot of like information given in the next few paragraphs. But the point is, because my child was overdue by 3 days, and because of my high blood pressure, they wanted to deliver the child on time, so that there is no damage or whatever, anything, any adverse effect on my child. So I think they asked me to be admitted to the hospital, and then they induced the labor, which means they sort of gave me an injection so that the delivery process starts. But for some reason, my child was I mean, he was like all, how do I say, cocooned, or like he was very comfortable inside, because I remember the doctor saying, like, "Oh, your child is so happy inside, he doesn't want to come out." So, but they were worried about my blood pressure as well. So after giving the injection, so like there was there was no, the waters didn't break, and the waters, they need to be broken in before the child comes out. So, and then they give me a second injection so that the process starts. But even then, there was no breaking of water. So I remember they had to forcefully break the waters. The doctors came and they were very worried about me. And then they broke the waters, and then they said, okay, fine, now I think your process starts. But it was a very long and painful one because they put me on epidural just to get help me with the pain and start the process. But even then, I was very exhausted and tired, from all these things. And I remember even before the delivery process starts, I mean, I could feel that I was very, because my blood pressure was shooting up, and my child's heart rate was going down. So they wanted to check whether my child was okay or not. So, and for that, they wanted some blood sample from him. But because my child was inside my tummy, they couldn't. So they sort of like, they did some tests, which was very painful. They tried to take blood from my son's head. I mean, and that was a very painful process. And I remember I just couldn't take the pain anymore. I was just thinking Guruji is there, and I was thinking it was snowing everywhere because, I mean, in Telford, it's in the Midlands of UK, so it used to snow a lot. So I was remembering that everything is white, and then Guruji is there, and I'm just thinking, like, and I remember my husband was crying that you don't die, because I was thinking that I'm just going somewhere, I'm just going to sleep. And then, I mean, after that, my blood pressure was so high, they had to put me on several other medications so that I don't, like, sort of, I'm stabilized. And after that, they thought maybe they'll do an emergency C-section. So they said that, Mrs. Das, don't worry, we are getting the operation theater ready for you. So the whole process was very painful for me. So I'll just continue. So our joy on the birth of but my son was eventually, he was delivered normally. I mean, I didn't need the C-section. A joy on the birth of a healthy child was soon replaced by deep concern, as initial blood tests on the child revealed some infection, and the child was not passing urine in the first few days after he was born. The doctors were not very sure about the source or the nature of the infection. As part of the investigation, they attempted lumbar puncture a few times on the 2-day-old child, but they failed to get a sample of the spinal fluid. As a result, they put him on a range of antibiotics, which they expected would deal with the infection, irrespective of its nature. However, the doctors were more worried about the baby not passing any urine in about the first 4 days after birth, despite being fed a lot more than the usual amount, at times using a drip to overcome any possible dehydration. Some of them seemed to start suspecting his kidneys, as the kidney function test results were off limits, of normal limits, while others advocated ruling out dehydration as the underlying cause by pushing more fluids down the baby before writing her for a kidney scan. So this was happening because my child, he didn't pass any urine when he was born, and my delivery, the whole process was also very painful because I needed some surgery as well. So, and I lost a lot of blood. And here in the UK, the doctors are of the opinion that if the child is born normally, then the lungs develop properly, and because he's pushing, he's struggling to come out from his mother's womb, and so that leads to like a healthier lung, and like, so they insist on having a normal delivery. So after all these things, my child was born after, I think, 24 hours of my labor. And after that, my child didn't pass any urine, which was very concerning for us because I wasn't very well. I was quite poorly. And then they did all these tests. And I literally couldn't walk to when they tried the lumbar puncture. That's a horrible thing to experience because as we know, they tie the body, in a rubber band, and it's just a tiny baby. It's a 2-day-old baby. And then it was horrible experience for me. And I just had, that's the thing. I just had faith in Guruji, and I just kept on crying and saying, help me out, Guruji, because there's nobody to help me. But ultimately, I think, I mean, when his tests were going on, and then something happened to me as well. And then, so we were both attendant after that. And then gradually, obviously, things came into, like, they fell into place. So, to add to my problems, my wife developed a severe urine infection with a temperature shooting up to 105 degrees. Both the mother and the baby being poorly, they were moved to critical care unit. I was absolutely alone in an alien land with no family or relatives. Even my colleagues had left as the project had ended. Guruji's photographs, the latter given to us by Guruji himself, and we touched it to the baby's body and placed it on his cot time and again. And his blessings were all that we had to look up to under such adverse circumstances, and we prayed to him more intensely than ever. So this happened on the third day of after my child was born, and I didn't even realize that I had 105, 106. Like it was very high, and I was literally, I couldn't walk even to the toilets. So when the nurses came for checking, because they do the checks every morning, and they were worried about me, and I couldn't even take the baby or even feed the baby. So they immediately called the doctor, and the doctor said, because my baby was crying, obviously, because the babies understand if something happens to the mom. So he was crying, and I remember the doctor said, like, I think, you should. The doctor obviously said it jokingly, but he was like, stop crying or your mom will be dead. I remember saying this, doctor saying this to my baby, because he was crying. He wasn't even, like, the nurses couldn't pick him up because he was crying a lot. And then they moved me immediately to the critical care unit, which is like not exactly the intensive care, but similar. And I remember going there, and they just started pushing all these antibiotics in both my arms, and the nurses took the baby away because they wanted me to survive first, to live first. And then it was a horrible time again after all these things, after all these labor and after all these hardships. So I was there, and I thought Guruji was maybe taking a test, and because I had given up, like, at that point, except like I just kept, because my child he wasn't urinating, he wasn't passing any urine. And I remember, like, after like a one day, I was like sort of quite conscious, and then the baby was, like, given to me. And then still my child didn't pass any urine, and I remember he was put on a cot with some mild, like some sort of a like a
Water,
heat, like a
water bed.
yeah, like a water bed. And then all the time I remember we put Guruji's picture on his like stomach, where like, or his kidneys. It was kept with him. And then I think finally after 3-4 days, while I was in the critical care, and I think my child passed urine, and I remember everybody in the ward, they came to me running, Mrs. Das, baby Das has peed. I mean, there was like, everybody smiled, and I was like, even I smiled in that condition, like, finally Guruji, you've listened to me. So yeah, times were like very, like, it was very like grim and horrible for me at that time. I mean, I still don't know if Guruji wasn't there, and the faith, and I still don't know how I would survive, because I wasn't even supposed to live with my infection at that point. So very soon things fell into place. The baby passed his long-awaited first urine, and we never heard about his infection again. The doctors now felt that probably the infection that showed up in the baby's stream actually was his mother's. My wife recovered after being treated with strong antibiotics, and both were released early after a couple of weeks after childbirth. So I remember, I think I was there in the hospital for 14 days, which is quite a long time in the UK if you have a normal delivery. But the doctors made sure that I was okay, and I was fit enough to handle my child, and even my child was okay after he was everything, all the tests were normal. And yeah, and I remember my husband, when I was there, I was going to the critical care. My husband, on that very day, he came and he told me that actually we have to move to London. And I couldn't even make sense because I was already quite like semi-conscious, because I had this horrible temperature, and I was in the infection, and with the infection, and I was in a sort of a, I said, why London? I couldn't understand what he was saying. He said that I have been assigned a project which is, we have to move to London. And I was in thinking that I can't even like walk to the toilet, and then why is he saying that we have to move to London? Like, I was quite, in a delirious state. Like, I couldn't make out, like, what are you saying? And then after that, when I was okay in the hospital, I was recovering. And then he said that, we have to move. And I said, how on earth are we going to move? The child is like 15 days old. How can I move? I can't even sit up properly. So anyway, but we managed, after, with Guruji's grace, by Guruji's grace, with Guruji's blessings, we finally moved to London, and we are still in London now after all this, like, maybe 19 years.
Yes, so I'm just looking for the last page. So this is the last bit. Yeah. Transferred to London. So she's reading from the book. I have printed off the pages, which is why the confusion. So this is the last paragraph left. Transferred to London. She has already mentioned half of it in conclusion of the last part. So I'll read the rest of it. So transfer to London. Though the deputation to Nottingham had ended following its successful completion, and all my colleagues had left, we had to stay back as my wife was into her 9th month of pregnancy then and could give birth any day. Even after my child was born, we decided to stay in the UK for one more month before we flew back to India with the baby. However, we were strongly advised against doing that before the child was at least 3-4 months old, as the flight could potentially damage his eardrums irreversibly. My line of business manager in India had promised to speak to the UK operations to look up a back-to-back assignment for me in the UK itself, but the chances of anything matching my skill profile turning up at a convenient location looked very slender. Kept praying to Guruji to remedy the situation, and within a week of my child's birth, I received a call from a business manager in the UK asking me whether I could move to the BBC site in London in a fortnight. Despite the complications following my childbirth and my wife still being in a lot of pain, Guruji's blessings enabled us to pack up lock, stock, and barrel and turn up in London with our 3-week-old child in time for the new assignment. The drive to London from Nottingham took 6 hours because of bad traffic instead of the normal 3, and was excruciatingly painful for my wife, but by Guruji's grace, she recovered quickly once in London, which is where we still are. So that was May 2007, and we still are in London after these many years. So this is where
This is 2005, the last Sangat, 2005.
Yeah, but the book was compiled in 2007. So that's where we still are in London, and obviously things have moved on a lot. We've settled down here. We first got permanent residency and then the British passport and all that. There were occasions, as I said, when we did try to go back, but seemed like Guruji wanted us to be here, and we have gone along with that. So this is where the satsang ends. But obviously, Guruji's blessings and miracles haven't ended. There's a long list of those even after this, after what has gone into the book.
I think in the book, I think we didn't mention a lot of things. Like, I think when the book was being written, my son, as I said, he had this horrible allergy called anaphylaxis, which means that if he used to have anything like any cow's milk, any soya milk, nuts, like even raw potatoes, if he touched it, he had this horrible allergy with which, like, if he even touched milk, then he would just have this red rashes, and that's like a normal allergy. But with anaphylaxis, the problem is if he ingests any milk or other things he was allergic to, then he used to have this breathing difficulty, and so he always needed this he was subsequently given this EpiPen, which is an injection which is life-saving. And so the first time he had the attack, I think that isn't mentioned in the book, that this was in like 2006 when he was a few months old. During weaning, I gave him some yogurt, and I didn't even realize that. I didn't even know what anaphylaxis is. As we all know, we only think in India, back in India, that allergy means something, there's a rash, and maybe that's it, and you have some anti-allergic and you're okay. But I never knew that any allergy could be potentially life-threatening. But when my son had that, and I didn't even realize that when I gave him the yogurt, he was like 6-7 months old. And then suddenly I saw his face was like all red, and he couldn't breathe. And I just kept praying to Guruji, what is happening? Just help me out. And then I called my husband, who was at BBC, and he said, I'll take at least like half an hour, 20 minutes to come back. And so I said, I don't have time to wait, because my son was, he couldn't breathe. He was like choking, and his lips and his whole face was swollen. So I just called 999, the number, emergency number 999. And nowadays, I think it takes a lot of time, with these ambulances arriving, and because everything is so busy, and everything has changed nowadays. There's a lot of pressure on the NHS, but back then in 2006, I think I couldn't even, when I rang them and they said, what's the problem? I couldn't even tell them what's the problem because I was crying. And they said, okay, fine, we are sending the ambulance like immediately. And I just kept the phone down, and within like a minute or something, there was a knock on the door, and the first responder came, and then he just like saved my son. Obviously, then the ambulance also arrived, and there were 4 or 5 paramedics, and then we took him to the hospital, and that's the first time I heard that any allergy could be so serious that it could just potentially kill you in 20 minutes. That was the window given to me, and I was given a set of instructions how to follow, what to do if by chance he had any milk. And so that was a source of tension for us all the time, because when he went to school, so he was made to sit, leaving a gap with his classmates, like, and he didn't understand why, because even contamination, cross contamination, could be potentially life-threatening for him. So, but by Guruji, and I used to keep worrying, Guruji, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And then I think after like 7, 8 years, enough continuously praying, Guruji, please help him, because he's going to grow up, and then he can't, and because I was worried about his calcium intake as well, because he couldn't have anything, any like, milk or any other things, like yogurt or
It's even allergic to soya. So
soya milk as well. So he couldn't have bread. So even I tried making bread at home, because otherwise he didn't know what bread was. He didn't know what yogurt was. He asked me how ice cream was. I said, it tastes horrible, trust me. So we didn't have anything, any ghee, any yogurt, any ice cream, nothing. When he went to his friend's house, like he used to carry his own food, which was, I think, very, very, I wouldn't say the word, very sad for a 5, 6 year old boy, that why am I so different? And I always used to encourage him, you have faith in Guruji, right? And so even since when he was a child, he used to go and pray to Guruji, Guruji, please help me with my allergies. And then eventually, I used to think, when he was like 8, 9 years old, he was 10 years old, going to India. It was such a pain, because in India, people somehow didn't understand the extent of his allergies, like with the cross contamination and everything, with the nut allergy particularly. So finally, one day, I think he was like 8 or 9, 7, 8 years old, and I dreamed that Guruji, I'm sitting at Guruji's feet, and Guruji is scolding me. He's saying, "Itna क्यों सोचती है?" Like, when time will come, मैं हूं ना. So, and that day I got my answer. So I stopped worrying. I said, like, Guruji has given me this dream that, like, he's there and I don't have to worry. And eventually it did, actually, when my son was 10, 10 and a half years old. He grew out of his, because they every year he had to go to the hospital, and they used to do these tests, because it was the hospital, because in case, he had any problems, there was this, they monitored his BP, there was this, like all the machines, like in case of an emergency, in case there was an attack. So they used to give him, like, try it on his lips, and then, feed him with like 5 ml of the milk. So eventually, with as time passed by, he grew out of his soya allergy and his milk allergy when he was 11 years old, which was such a, like, relief, big relief for me, just the milk allergies, and that's what I asked him, because there's milk everywhere, like any contamination wherever he goes, because anyway. So I was so thankful, and by Guruji's blessings, by Guruji's grace, he gradually grew out of his milk allergy. His nut allergy is still there, but he can have like a couple of nuts. That also by Guruji's grace, and I was always worried about what's going to happen to him, in case he goes to, like, where will he go, where will he study. And by Guruji's grace, he's turned out to be a fine young boy, and recently he's gone to university, and actually he did pretty well. He's studying maths at Oxford University, and even his results, by Guruji's grace, it was amazing. He's one of the national high scorers in further maths, which is, like, we can't even express I mean, how blessed we are, and how blessed he is. He every morning, every day, he, even at university, he has, he has, Guruji's locket, and he has Guruji's picture, and in the morning, in the evening, in anything he does, like, he prays to Guruji, and like, so I'm just so thankful, and I'm so blessed that Guruji is still with us. Hardships are there, but we've always kept a faith in Guruji. Like, it's like he's there, no one else is there, and whatever happens, it's like exactly as he said. Like, he's my father. He's like, whatever happens, I say, Guruji, help us, and we know he's there for us.
okay, so I think yeah, so we we've completed the reading of our satsangs in the book, and then a bit more. So I think I can now hand over to the host. If there are any questions or anything, then you can let us know, or we can answer them now. So basically, we'll go on mute now, and we'll hand over to the host. Thank you very much for listening. Jai Guruji.
थैंक यू अंकल, थैंक यू आंटी, बहुत बहुत शुक्राना गुरु जी महाराज जी का। जय गुरु जी। अब गुरु जी से आज्ञा लेती हूँ। शुक्राना गुरु जी महाराज जी का। जय गुरु जी।
जय गुरु जी, शुक्राना गुरु जी।